Désolé avec le vote.
So, sorry about the vote and the slight delay we had. Hopefully we'll be able to catch up. Now I'm going to call this meeting to order, exceptionally replacing the chair, Mr. Morrissey, so as the vice chair of this committee, HUMA Committee for Bloc Québécois, I'm going to open call the meeting to order. So welcome to meeting number 35 of the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Pursuant to the motion adopted on Thursday, February 5, 2026, the committee is meeting on housing starts in relation to federal programs. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room or remotely using the Zoom application. Before we begin, I'd like to ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are, but I think our witnesses are going to be online, both of them. So these measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. You will notice that there's a QR code on the card, and it links to a short awareness video. We don't have witnesses in the room here, but it's a good reminder for the members who are here. For the meeting to proceed smoothly, I'd like to make some general comments. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. For interpretation, for those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel, for English or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For MPs here in the room, if you'd like to take the floor, please put your hand up. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. Now, the clerk and myself will do our best to keep a speaking order, and thank you for your patience and understanding. I would now like to, without further ado, welcome our witnesses. From Canadian Home Builders Association, by video conference, we have Mr. Kevin Lee, Chief Executive Officer, and from Missing Middle Initiative, I also see participating by video conference Mr. Mike Moffat, Founding Director. Each witness will have 5 minutes for their opening remarks. And we're going to start with Mr. Lee. I think he will be the first one to go for Canadian Home Builders Association.
Thank you very much. Bonjour. D'habitude, je suis en Ottawa.
Hello. I'm usually in Ottawa, but today I am connecting from Quebec City.
Here, so thanks a lot for having me today. The Canadian Home Builders Association, or CHBA, represents over 8,500 member firms across the country. Our members build low-rise, mid-rise, and high-rise homes for both ownership and for rent. Housing starts are often presented as a single headline number, but the breakdown of that number is important to see the real story. While the recent data shows that total housing starts have been above historic averages, the composition of those starts has shifted dramatically, and in a way that puts long-term affordability, economic stability, and home ownership further out of reach for Canadians. Over the last several years, housing starts intended for homeownership have declined sharply as a share of total construction. In 2021, 69% of housing starts were intended for ownership. By 2025, that share had fallen to 49%, with purpose-built rental housing now accounting for the majority of new housing starts. That's a drop of 50,000 units for ownership per year. In fact, last week's Spring Economic Update acknowledged that while housing starts totaled 260,000 units in 2025, it was driven by record levels of purpose-built rental construction supported by federal measures. Rental supply is needed, and CHBA strongly supports it, along with federal action that has helped projects pencil out in recent years. However, rental housing should not be replacing homes for ownership. We need both, and we need much more on the ownership side. The federal government has set ambitious targets to double housing starts, yet CMHC numbers show that achieving affordability requires not just more homes, but more homes for ownership. CMHC has stated that 4.8 million homes are needed over the next decade to fill the housing gap, and that would mean nearly doubling our starts to between 430 and 480,000 starts annually. CMHC states also, however, that to exceed 75% of those starts need to be for ownership. It should also be noted that the increase in housing starts for rental is not the result of consumer preference. CHBA polling with Abacus Research shows that 88% of Canadians under 45 would like to own a home one day. It is the outcome of policies at all levels of government that has made achieving that goal increasingly difficult. Builder sentiment, as measured by CHBA's Housing Market Index, reflects this reality. In BC, the single-family HMI is at 5.8 out of 100. In Ontario, the multifamily HMI is at 3.8 out of 100. Even Alberta, which has been strong, is now seeing a drop in their HMI. Across the country, confidence among builders has deteriorated to record lows, indicating still fewer starts for ownership ahead, a trend that must be reversed. High sales taxes and development taxes, restrictive mortgage policies, and municipal red tape causing delays, excessive building code changes, and escalating material and labor costs have significantly driven up the cost of construction and reduced the viability of ownership housing projects. If buyers can't not buy, then builders simply cannot build. There's been much talk, including a study from this committee on Build Canada Homes, which will focus on government-subsidized non-market housing. The development of more non-market homes is indeed important, but it is critical that in parallel, there be a strong effort beyond BCH to address housing affordability to double starts in market rate housing where 95% of Canadians reside. In order to increase housing starts and return to affordability, there needs to be a more comprehensive housing plan, especially for ownership. And we saw some movement in the right direction in the spring economic update and recent federal announcements, such as funding of $1.7 billion to go to provinces and territories through the Improving Housing Supply Act, including contributing to the removal of HST on qualifying new homes in Ontario. But other than the deal with Ontario, and even that is still stalled due to the lack of FedProv agreement on who will administer the rebate.
Monsieur Lee, on me mentionne pour les...
Mr. Lee, I'm just getting a heads up. I am going to stop your time. You have 1 minute and 5 seconds left. I'm just going to ask you to slow down a little bit to allow our interpreters to fully convey everything you're saying. I know you have a lot to share.
Sure, no problem. I'll also say that no other federal provincial partnerships have yet been announced, and there seems to be no guarantee that provinces will use the funds to reduce the tax burden. Announcements for infrastructure and to offset DCs through a Build Community Strong Fund will be helpful too, but again, outside Ontario, no other provincial deals have been signed. It would be critical that there be plans for municipalities to find alternative funding models for infrastructure to permanently lower DCs once the federal funding winds down. The spring economic update also made reference to streamlining regulations and addressing affordability issues with regards to building codes and standards. There's been talk of this for a few years now, but no action has really been taken. And in the meantime, the 2025 building code was published, increasing costs of a typical 2,500 square foot home by an estimated $50,000 to over $100,000. Immediate action is needed to reverse this. It's positive to see plans to support more construction financing, but what is also needed is fixing the stress test so that well-qualified buyers can better access a mortgage. And by the way, that's a no-cost measure. And there are several other recommendations I could go through, but respecting time, I'll be happy to take any questions you may have during the Q&A period. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to that.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, effectivement, vous avez bien fait votre...
Thank you very much. You've done your 5 minutes. Now we're going to give the floor to Mr. Mike Moffat from the Missing Middle Initiative for his 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. The federal government has set an ambitious target of reaching 500,000 annual housing starts by the year 2035. And an ambitious target is admirable, but it's no substitute for a goal. Because a housing target is a means, it's not an end, it's not a goal. A young family in search of a home does not care how many housing starts there were last year. They care about finding a home that they can afford in their community that meets their needs. So Canada's lack of a middle-class housing goal creates a policy vacuum that the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate has attempted to fill with a recent report advocating a 2060 target to address the middle-class housing crisis. That goal or target, if adopted, would cement a future of intergenerational inequality for generations Z, Alpha, and Beta threatening to tear apart the country's social and economic fabric. The federal government needs a housing plan with a clear goal, with a reasonable time frame and a set of quantifiable objectives, such as every middle-class dual-earner couple in their 30s should be able to afford to purchase or rent a new entry-level home in any community in the country suitable for a household of 5 by 2035. That's just one example. There are many goals that the federal government could come up with, but it needs to have one. And we should be clear that the purpose of such a goal is not for the federal government to engage in central planning, deciding where homes are built and at what price, but rather it is to set up the conditions for success, to understand what is working well in the current housing system and what requires improvements. Defining a clear goal clarifies the trade-offs in public policy, ensuring optimal value for money. And most importantly, a clear goal should be based on the attainability of new housing, an emphasis on new. Government should not be in the business of trying to manipulate resale home prices. Rather, it should be about ensuring that builders can create suitable options that families can afford, and that the market can respond to changing conditions, such as unexpected population increases, and then government can fill in the gaps with below market rate housing where necessary. So multiple objectives with intermediate targets are needed. A simple target of 500,000 homes by 2035 says nothing about the size of those homes, or as Mr. Lee pointed out, whether or not they're owned or rented, where they are located, how attainable they are, and what the policy path to get there will be. And that path is important, that achieving that simple 500,000 start target is becoming increasingly out of reach, as the CMHC projects that housing starts will decline over the next 3 years, falling below 220,000 units by 2028. Now, this decline can be reversed, but only if the federal government develops a clear plan of how it will achieve that target and links policy reforms to policy outcomes. So take Build Canada Homes, for example. The federal government's flagship program lacks key performance indicators and accountability measures. We do not know or have not been told how many housing starts that this program will contribute to each year. And finally, I want to say a word of caution about the housing start metric. Unlike our global counterparts, the CMHC does not record a project in their housing start data until the foundation meets ground level. So it is a poor real-time indicator of the health of the housing construction sector, as it reflects investment decisions made anywhere from 1 to 3 years before the CMHC records it as a housing start. So at the Missing Middle, we've been suggesting that the CMHC should also consider tracking excavations, as the US and Australia do, to provide a better real-time indicator of new construction activity. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Merci beaucoup pour vos remarques.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks. We've taken a lot of note. I'm now going to, for this first round, by the way, as we wait for the arrival of the chair, I will keep my speaking block for the Bloc Québécois. If it's okay for everyone, it's a little peculiar as far as situations go. But first off, we're going to go to Mr. Aitchison for 6 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, thank you for being here, both of you. Again, Kevin, you actually got to speak this time. That's nice, eh? I wonder if I could start maybe with Dr. Moffat. You, at the end of your comments, you spoke a little bit about how we count starts. And this is one of the things, we're talking about housing starts. The minister stood in the House and bragged about how housing starts are up. And I'm not suggesting he's lying, but how we count these things matters, and there seems to be a lot of different ways to count this. Can you elaborate just a little bit on that and what a start really is and what we're doing in this country and how we maybe need to do a bit better?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the common sense definition of a start might be something where, shovel hits the ground, that you actually have workers on the site starting to build the home. But when it comes to the types of homes we build, which these days are traditionally high-rise units that have underground parking garages, The CMHC doesn't count that as a start until the entire underground parking garage is built, and that could be 4, 5, 6 layers. And then that parking garage basically hits level ground, and then you start kind of building the apartment structure on top of that. And that's a kind of bespoke Canadian way of doing things that other countries define a start differently. So the UK, it's actually when they kind of start pouring the foundation. And for other countries, it's when they start actually digging the hole. So what we have suggested to the CMHC is tracking excavations. That would give us a better real-time indicator of when a project has actually started, where work is being done. And we recognize that not all excavations will always necessarily turn into housing completions, but at least gives us a better sense of what's happening on the ground.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I want to move over to Mr. Lee. This is kind of a weird thing to do, I guess, maybe, but I'm wondering if you could comment on what Dr. Moffat said and if you agree with that assessment, and then I'll have a follow-up based on what you say.
Yeah, I think that's important too, because one of the things that we're not good at tracking is sort of leading indicators. It's why we have our housing market index, which is a sentiment indicator that tracks even ahead of sales. It's more what's going on with sales, but what is the traffic like? Because we need to be better at what's coming down the pipe. So what Mr. Moffat is talking about would get us closer to actually housing starts, which are basically a lagging indicator too, because you've already made your sales and you're getting going. But at least we would be ahead, and we wouldn't have the false security right now that there's a lot of housing starts right now, because a lot of those starts were parking garages, as Mr. Moffat is saying, that started a while ago. It's not, yay, we're off to the races here. So I think it's an important distinction that we need to continue to make.
So is it fair to say then that in some cases we're calling housing completions a start instead of actually a start? Like I understand from some of the larger builders, and particularly some of the larger centers like the Lower Mainland and Vancouver, I've been told by some of those builders that there'll be probably 40,000 units come online, 20,000 units come online over the course of the next year. But those are projects that were literally started 4 or 5 years ago, 4 years ago. But nobody's digging any new holes. This is why this is an important distinction?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We're not, I wouldn't say we're counting completions as starts, but we're catching these starts that have actually started a long time ago, calling them starts now and suggesting we're in better shape than we actually are. Those started when the market was completely different, as you pointed out, and we're basically seeing nothing going on in many cases right now in terms of legit housing starts.
So can you tell us definitively, are starts up or down? What's going on with true starts, like people digging holes to start building a house or
So overall starts would be down, and again, we don't have that exact data because of exactly what Mr. Moffat was talking about. What I can tell you is starts for ownership are way down, because they've been replaced by purpose-built rentals. So anything in sort of terms of treading water has been because we've replaced ownership with purpose-built rental, and the ownership side of things is way down.
Dr. Moffat, would you agree with the assessment that, rentals are important, but they cannot supplant the importance of home ownership, and that still has to be an important part of the mix in Canada's housing market?
Yeah, absolutely. We need both. And, I think we're also starting to see a slowdown in purpose-built rental construction in some markets, that there are concerns that there are a lot of new inventory getting built. Many of those decisions were made when Canada's population was growing by 1 to 1.5 million persons per year. And now industry doesn't really know the future of immigration policy to past 2027. So I think we're also going to start to see a slowdown on the purpose-built rental construction. So it's not even zero sum. I think we're going to see a scaling back of both.
Okay, we really only have about 30 seconds left, but I think what I'll do is we'll continue on to the next question. We got started a little bit late, so we'll let somebody else go. I may get a chance to talk to you again, so we'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Aitchison. Madame de Rocher pour 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'm going to start by thanking our witnesses for being with us today and for the work they have been doing over the last number of months and years, because I know that they've been involved in all kinds of conversations around housing. So thank you for your involvement, for your ideas.
Mr. Moffat, you've mentioned quite a few elements that have been holding back constructions and, slowing the growth of new housing supply. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit more about which out of all of these challenges, which one has the biggest impact, and particularly where the federal government, in your view, can actually do something about it. Because, and I'll come back to the municipality and the the Bill Canada Strong Fund that you mentioned, Mr. Lee, but if you can start, I'd be interested in that. Thank you.
Well, I would say the biggest challenge right now is the cost of construction, that we've seen the price of resale homes fall, but for the most part, the cost of construction hasn't. The materials to build a home haven't gotten any cheaper, and in fact, with challenges across geopolitical challenges, some of those have actually gone up. We have seen some land price decreases in certain markets, but overall it's tough for the federal government, or it's tough for builders to build something to compete with the resale market. I think where the federal government can be the most immediate help is actually what they've already done on HST, expanding that to other provinces. That takes anywhere from 5 to about 15% off the cost of the new home, depending on the province. And because the HST only applies to new homes, it helps become cost competitive. Over the long run, I think you are then, looking at, working with municipalities on issues like development charges, and again, with the Ontario agreement. And I think just de-risking. And again, one of the biggest challenges I think builders and developers have right now, particularly in high-rise, is they don't know the future of federal government's immigration policies. When I talk to builders and developers in high-rise, the ones that are going to continue to build right now are the ones who are making a bet that immigration numbers will go up in the future, and the ones who are on the sidelines are thinking, the demand's not going to be there. So being able to give industry, kind of a 10-year timeline instead of what we have now, which kind of ends in 2027, and nobody's really sure how many homes are going to need in the future because we don't know how fast the population will grow.
Mr. Lee, so I'm just wondering, I know we've had many conversations on Build Canada Home, and it's in my unbiased opinion, it's off to a great start. Once it gets voted, once we pass Bill C-20, it will become a Crown Corporation, and of course, I'll be happy to put forward some KPIs as part of its departmental plan. But I'm just wondering, we're seeing already that it brings to the table different, more flexible methods of financing, different kinds of capital, and I'm wondering, Mr. Lee, what impact you think it can have on the pace and the cost of building in Canada?
Well, I think it's going to be important for, non-market housing, and we need more of it. And, it's one of the things we've talked about is the need to make smart use of federal lands so that we can offset some of the costs of construction. Because as Mr. Moffat said, the price of building new things is just going up and up. And as you rightly pointed out, the way we can deal with that quickly is through taxes and reducing those.
So I just want to, because we keep talking about this 5 versus 95 and how we really need to also think about the 95. But I just want to remind everyone, a lot of the program from CMHC and a lot of the program in Build Canada Home will also build market. Yes, it is, but there will be a lot of mixed use projects, and we're seeing a lot of them, even those that we already announced, right? So I just want to clarify that conversation a little bit.
I haven't seen those numbers. The numbers that we're looking at are, up to 49,000 units on lands that have been identified for the program, right? 49,000 is a good number if it's in 1 year, but it's going to be spread over many years compared to we were actually to double housing starts 500,000 that we need. So I think it's just putting it in context, and that's not to say anything bad about Build Canada Homes. I think there's going to be some really good work there. And I think, the idea of also helping to create a more steady pipeline for some of our factory-built members. That can be a good thing. It's a start, but we do have to look at the rest as well. I think Build Canada Homes will have a part, but it's everything else that's going to make up. We're not going to double housing starts with Build Canada Homes. We're going to have to do it with the rest of the market.
Okay, thank you. Maybe my last question is to both of you, and it's about really, coordination between federal, provincial, municipal, and the $64,000 question of harmonizing building codes. In your opinion, is there a path to get there, to do that? And, just if you can offer your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I can say that the idea of harmonizing building code is good if you're harmonizing to a good building code. We've got major challenges right now with the way the building code is being developed, the costs that are implicated. The 2025 building code, we estimate the cost of that for a 2,500 square foot house will be about $56,000 or more, and that's not including the energy numbers. So if we're going to move to harmonization, which would be great, and we could also get harmonization right down to the municipal level, because municipalities have all kinds of regulations and zoning and bylaws that prevents us from building the same house twice. Get that pursuit is very important, but we have to get what we're harmonizing to right. Otherwise, we're not going to get harmonization. And you're seeing provinces pull back right now because they're recognizing the costs and implications of a more expensive, complex code.
Merci, Madame de Rocher. Madame Larouche pour...
Thank you, Mr. Rocher. Ms. Larouche for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So welcome to the committee. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today for this study on housing starts. So I'd like to thank Mr. Lee. I'd like to thank Mr. Moffat. Before asking my questions, towards the end of your opening remarks, Mr. Moffat, you spoke about some international examples. I think you referred to Australia. It was right at the very end. So I'd like to give you an opportunity to go back to that part of your opening remarks, and if you would like to elaborate by giving us more international examples.
The only three I'd have memorized, I'd have to go back and look. But every country defines a housing start differently. So Australia and the United States defines it as when the excavation starts on site. That counts as a housing start. The UK is when they start pouring the foundation. So it's kind of in between. Whereas we in Canada, we define it as when that foundation reaches ground level. And these distinctions didn't used to matter all that much back when Canada was mostly building single detached homes, because the timeline between when you start digging the hole, when you pour the foundation, when the foundation reaches grades, is usually a matter of weeks. So oftentimes that was all kind of happening in the same month anyway. But now we're moving to more complex high-rise apartments, most of which have underground parking. The difference between the timeline of when you start digging the hole and when the foundation reaches grade can be up to about 18 months or so different.
So that comes into play when we're calculating the number of housing starts, because we're talking about these numbers quite a bit. So now my question for Mr. Lee, from your opening remarks from both of you actually today, yourself and Mr. Moffat, my first question would be, is that many builders, many developers are saying that there are programs, but the starts aren't happening as quickly as these could be. Is it funding or the paperwork?
Depends what you're talking about. If you're talking about purpose-built rental programs that are using CMHC programming, those can often get oversubscribed, and some of the requirements too that are getting more and more stringent are making some of the project less viable. Now that said, we've had quite a bit of purpose-built rental construction over the past few years, and as Mr. Moffat said, we're probably going to see a bit of a slowdown on that right now in many cases. When it comes to units for home ownership, that's an entirely different situation, and certainly in our more expensive provinces like Ontario and BC, it just becomes so cost prohibitive to buy. There's so many affordability challenges right now that we're just seeing a complete absence in many ways of sales that's resulting in a lot fewer starts. It's back to if buyers can't buy, builders can't build.
Parfait.
Perfect. So one of the challenges for these starts would be predictability. I think Mr. Moffat referred to the immigration policy of the government, and you referred quite a bit to predictability, which is not sufficient for companies, for builders and developers?
Correct. Again, particularly for, I would say, high-rise purpose-built rental, because newcomers to Canada disproportionately end up in that kind of housing. So it's particularly sensitive to immigration rights. And because we don't have kind of a line of sight to both permanent and non-permanent residents past 2027, builders and developers are basically making their investments, having to basically make a bet on the future of immigration policy. So that kind of certainty is important, and certainty on other issues like taxes and development charges and so on. The more uncertainty there is, the higher the returns have to be on building a new home, because the project is just inherently riskier.
Parfait, merci.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lee, in 30 seconds, the federal government makes a lot of announcements, but families are still waiting for concrete results. So how can we make sure that each dollar that is announced actually goes into the ground in the form of a new start?
I think what we can start with is we had a couple of examples of partnerships that were announced with the province of Ontario, and they're going to very directly deal with taxes, one dealing with development taxes, the other dealing with the HST. And I think as we look to roll out the government looks to roll out partnerships with the other provinces, is going to be really important that they be done in a very similar way, because it's not clear that that'll be the case. So the $1.7 billion that gets allocated to other provinces should really be going to the sales tax side of things and offsetting those. When it's the Build Canada or Build Community Strong Fund, again, really an emphasis on direct results, dealing with DCs and dealing with the infrastructure, freezing DCs. Those are all really important things that have a big impact on affordability and can lead directly to starts.
See, Madame LaRouche. Mr.
Thank you, Ms. LaRouche.
5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for coming here today. We really appreciate your time. My first question is for Mr. Lee. You had mentioned that we need about 480,000 starts a year to 500,000. Are we anywhere near that right now?
No. And that's coming from, those are numbers that CMHC has put forward in order to close the affordability gap. It's an important aspirational target. We have so many things to get out of the way to be able to do that. But no, we're quite a ways from being able to achieve that.
So my background before getting here, I spent 20 years in construction. I've built a high-rise. I was the electrical foreman on a high-rise myself, residential units. And contractors, developers, they're in the business of actively seeking projects to build. What would you say is the biggest barrier right now that are holding back private developers from moving forward on projects, especially since we seem to be in high demand for housing right now.
Yeah, well, we would be in high demand based on sort of that gap analysis that CMHC is talking about. And you look at household formation and that, or household formation that should be happening, because in many cases, household formation isn't happening because of affordability issues. But the big challenge that we're facing right now is that affordability crunch. And when people, when you look at developers build, sell 70-80% of the units before they can get started to get their construction financing. So when you're getting very few sales, you just can't proceed. And even with low rise, there's a lot less spec building going on in all the times of uncertainty. So again, builders are waiting to actually be able to make sales, and that's been a big crunch. And we keep talking about Ontario and BC, but that's where we have the biggest challenges. Things have been going okay in Atlantic Canada, although they're starting to slow down now, and same with the prairies. Alberta's coming off 2 record years of starts, but again, with all the consumer confidence issues and that, we're seeing slowdowns right across the board right now.
So in your opening statement, you also mentioned that the housing starts have shifted from market more towards non-market. What do you think the reason for that is?
Well, I was just to be clear, I was saying they've shifted from units for ownership to purpose-built rental. Fair. And the reason for that is a couple of things. One is, affordability. People can't afford to buy homes, whether they're ground oriented or in a high rise, and so they're moving towards rental. And the other thing is the rental market has been helped quite a bit by changes in taxation policy and other financing that has been necessary to better equip industry to be able to make projects pencil out, because for the longest time they weren't, and therefore industry was building condos and selling those units into the secondary market. The changes that have been made to make purpose-built rental more viable have been important and good to help that out. But again, we can't be trading off purpose-built rental and building a lot more of that and less ownership. We need more units for ownership as well.
You'd also mentioned municipal taxes and development charges as being a pretty significant cost to obviously the homeowner, the builder. Has Build Canada Homes done anything to address that issue? Obviously, those are different per jurisdiction, but is there anything in Build Canada Homes that has addressed that issue?
Not that I'm aware of. Again, Build Canada Homes is really looking at non-market housing on public lands, and that's a different issue than dealing with the development taxes. They might end up with deals where they get development taxes waived, which is pretty common for different types of subsidized housing. But when you talk about development taxes and development charges across the country, hopefully, what is the Build Community Strong Fund is talking about, well, we'll give out money for infrastructure dollars, but we need to see DCs rolled back where they're really expensive or at least frozen. And we also need to recognize that municipalities have come to rely on development charges to fund a lot of things beyond what they're supposed to be funding, and that's where they've gotten trapped. And so it's really important moving forward that the feds, the provinces work with the municipalities to find other funding mechanisms so that they're not putting this tax burden on the backs of new home buyers. And to be clear, builders and developers are only the financiers of development taxes until the homeowners ultimately pay for it. It's the home buyer that ultimately pays for all of these taxes.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Reynolds, right on time. Monsieur Joseph, pour 5 minutes.
Mr. Joseph for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses as well for being with us today. I'm going to ask my first question to Mr. Moffat. Now, our government is working on the immigration file. What do you think the impact of reduced immigration targets would be on the rental housing market?
Well, I think we would get fewer rental starts and continued downward pressure on prices, just simply because there wouldn't be as much demand there. So, and to be clear, at Missing Middle, we're not calling for any particular immigration target. What we're suggesting is having more certainty around the future path of both permanent and non-permanent residency would allow for builders and developers to make more informed plans, because they wouldn't be guessing at the future level of demand.
Okay. Merci, monsieur. Et je vais vous poser une autre...
Thank you. What do you think are the main factors that determine or the speed at which new starts take place?
Well, it's a number of factors. That clearly economic conditions play a role. That builders and developers won't build things unless it's sufficiently profitable and they can obtain financing. The approvals process matters quite a bit, and this can vary substantially depending on the jurisdiction, what's involved, the types of processes that they have. And it also depends on the type of homes being built. That particularly historically, the high-rise condo market, as Mr. Lee has pointed out, is highly reliant on having 70 to 80% or more of the homes sold in pre-sale. So in a hot housing market, those pre-sales can happen very quickly, but at a time when home prices are flat or falling and investors are not interested in providing the pre-construction capital, it can be a long time to hit that 70 to 80% target. So that slows the process as well. So it's a combination of both economic and regulatory factors.
Merci, monsieur. Je vais continuer sur la...
Thank you. I will continue in the same vein. You touched upon a number of points. Which of the factors you've referred to in your opening remarks would you say have the biggest impact on the current market?
I think it really depends on the type of market. So I think for low rise, it's particularly development charges and land prices and land use. I think for purpose-built rental, that the federal government has enacted a number of helpful policies over the last decade, particularly through the CMHC, with programs like ACLP and MLI Select, and increasing the accelerated capital cost allowance on new apartment construction. So all that's been very helpful. I think now, again, we're going to start to see a slowdown in rental apartment construction because of concerns that we may have overbuilding. And in the condo market, I think that, again, the biggest challenge is that companies or builders and developers are really struggling to sell pre-construction units, and there's such a available inventory right now that if somebody wants a new condo, there's a lot for sale out there. So instead of buying a pre-construction unit and waiting a few years, they can take possession of quite a more affordable unit today.
I have 20 seconds left. Mr. Moffat talked about federal lands. What do you think the role that federal lands could play in all this is?
I think it could be quite important. Now, it's there can be challenges of where that land is located relative to where new housing is needed. But absolutely, if the federal government has land in an area that has a housing shortage and is ripe to build on, then I think it absolutely makes sense for the federal government to use that land and retain ownership of that land and use that to build new homes.
Merci, Monsieur Joseph.
Thank you, Mr. Joseph. Ms. Larouche? For 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us this afternoon. For the second round, I'm going to start with Mr. Lee. So in Quebec, needs are somewhat different compared to Toronto or Vancouver. Should the federal government let Quebec and the provinces decide the general direction in which they want to go regarding housing?
Oh, that's the great federation question. I will say that one of the things that we've looked for from the federal government is some leadership on all of these files, and that's really important. The conversation around development taxes and development charges, the conversation around delays at the municipal level. Those are not things that are in the federal government purview typically. But because of the way things have gone, we need that kind of leadership at the federal level to get everybody headed in the right direction. I would say the same goes for the building code. There needs to be a good collaboration between the provinces and the federal government to get that national building code right. We need to harmonize, but we need to harmonize on something that actually makes sense. So I think it's one of those housing is one of those things it's really provincial domain, but can really benefit from some collaboration between all levels of government, frankly. And the only way we're going to solve the housing crisis is when we get the federal government, the provincial governments, and the municipal governments all rowing in the same direction to address a lot of these issues.
So collaboration and respecting the jurisdiction of each other. Mr. Moffat, Quebec already has some tools when it comes to housing. Should the federal government transfer more funds without strings attached in order to increase housing without replicating or duplicating existing structures?
Well, when there is equivalency, I think it's absolutely useful to do that. So one example I would give is that there are provinces that have very low or no development charges. They should not be penalized by the federal government and not get access to similar payments like Ontario simply because they're not overly reliant on development charges. So I do think the federal government, when looking at these deals, has to consider what provinces have already done. And if a province is performing particularly well in an area, that they shouldn't get access to reduced funding for that.
See, Madame LaRouche.
Thank you, Ms. LaRouche. Ms. Goodrich, 4 or 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair.
Witnesses for being here. I really found it interesting, and specifically, Mr. Lee, I found it really unique, the stat you quoted about how 88% of people under 45 want to buy a home one day. And we've been sitting here through this committee, and it's become so clear that the government of Canada, the Liberal government's plan is really to try and get as many rental homes, and that's not taking into account the 88% that want to buy a home. I was wondering, could you touch on what impacts the ongoing tariffs are having on increased home building costs in Canada?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's been a lot of concern over the tariffs, and rightly so, when it would come to construction costs. But we do have to remember that other than a few countervailing tariffs that Canada has kept in place, most of those tariffs are on goods going into the United States, so that affects American construction costs and home buyers much more than it does here. The biggest challenge that we have actually with the trade war is on consumer confidence. And that's the huge issue. And there's so much uncertainty. You just see people not wanting to make the big investments. And then, of course, you couple that with some areas that have been more strongly hit by the trade war where you're seeing job loss. And of course, you're going to have a lot less housing activity. So yes, it has some impact in some ways in construction costs, but really the big impact that we've seen with the trade war is just on the market completely freezing up in many ways because people don't want to move with these types of big purchases when there's so much uncertainty.
So I have the absolute privilege of representing Fort McMurray, which is the town I grew up in. And what we've seen for the last 10 years is minus the houses that were rebuilt from the fire, we've had effectively no homes built for the last 10 years. And it was really interesting in the post-fire piece. One of the biggest challenges some of the people had was that their homes were built in an era, and to rebuild to that code was no longer legal. And so it was a very interesting space where they were trying to figure out how can they rebuild, and they were having these struggles between their insurance company that didn't want to pay for them to be able to rebuild, but code prevented certain things and was actually driving up the cost. And in your comments, you were mentioning about the building codes and the importance of having the right building code. And so what would your recommendation be on the current 2025 building code? Would you recommend that the government just pause this and relook at some of these things that perhaps are just excessive red tape and not necessarily geared towards safety?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's exactly what we're calling for. We're calling for a pause on building codes, and we're not alone in this. In fact, we were talking about international examples earlier. Australia has already done it. Australia has already said we need a pause on changes to the building code as it affects housing in particular, because things are getting too expensive and we're going too far too fast. So when we look at the 2025 code, we think it's really important that we actually take a pause and look at it and say, you know what, there are some important things in that code that around health and safety and corrections and those sort of things that do need to be done. But there's a bunch of other things that are adding a lot of cost for not a lot of return right now. And those things should be put on hold. Let's find better ways to do them and put in place a code that isn't going to drive up the cost of housing at a time when we can't afford it.
Mr. Lee, could you give an example of something that is adding cost but doesn't impact safety? Because I think a lot of people are very concerned about safety, and that's critical. I know I am extremely concerned about making sure that our homes that we're building are safe. But if it's just because someone managed to lobby the government to get this code changed, if you could give any examples, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, I think there's a few different examples. One that comes to mind actually is around safety, but it's actually doing safety properly. One of the most expensive things coming in 2025 code, something called lateral loads, and lateral loads is about protecting from earthquakes, which is obviously hugely important, but also protecting against high winds. And of course, we're getting a lot of new high wind events in this country. But we've actually had zero incidents of actual failure from high winds on existing housing. And whether that's a hurricane hitting Atlantic Canada or a derecho blowing through Ontario and causing millions of dollars of damage in terms of trees falling and that kind of thing. But we don't actually need to build our houses completely differently and have all kinds of engineering requirements to do it. It's too much under the current circumstances, and probably is too much, period. And that's the kind of thing we need to revisit and say, what's the smart thing to do here? What's the right amount of dealing with lateral loads versus the excessive amount that's, we're experiencing in BC, where they've started with this ahead of the National Building Code, engineering costs of $30,000 and more to do this kind of work on a house that you didn't used to require any engineering. So we got to get things like that correct.
Merci, Madame Goodrich. Just to clarify, we have time to do another round after we conclude this one. Mr. Chang, no? Mr. Oh, no. Well, who we got? No, Mr. Chang for 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you both for being with us this afternoon. Mr. Lee, as the national housing strategy continues to evolve, what do you see as its most important success to date? And where do you see there are the best opportunities to build on the progress going forward?
Well, I think when the National Housing Strategy was put together a decade ago, it was very much aimed at non-market housing and social housing, and a lot of progress has been made. And obviously, you want to continue to make that kind of progress. The one thing that was missing from the National Housing Strategy was dealing with the rest of the market. Like we say, the 95% of the market where the rest of Canadians live and want to be able to afford a home without subsidies and that. And so that's where we need to go with the next National Housing Strategy, is make sure it's comprehensive. so that we look at continuing to look at rental that is, being built and is affordable, but also affordable rent leads to affordable units for home ownership as well. People should be able to afford a home. We know the stats of what Canadians want to do, but it's also critically important if we're going to get enough housing built that Canadians be able to afford it and be able to use their own investments to help invest in Canada's growing housing stock, which we ultimately need. So we also need to remember that when it comes to social housing and supporting those most in core housing need, we'll never be able to support them properly if people can't afford their own homes and we don't have affordability dealt with. Otherwise, if you don't deal with market rate affordability, you'll be building more social housing and wondering why the lineup keeps getting longer out the door. And the reason will be because people can't afford their own rent and can't afford to buy, and it messes up the whole system. So, your question about where do we go with the National Housing Strategy, it needs to be comprehensive. It needs to be that full continuum so that we can truly address all elements. Otherwise, whenever one part of the continuum fails, the others get affected very quickly.
Thank you. And from your perspective, have the federal programs encouraged innovation in construction method or faster project timelines in any meaningful way?
I think we're just getting started on that. Some of the biggest barriers to actually being able to, let's use the example of more factory built because it gets talked about so much and modular construction. Although we can invest more and be able to do that more and even more effectively to build houses faster, and we have a labor shortage, so there's a lot to be said for that. There are so many barriers right now in terms of regulation, interpretation of code, and that we really need to go after that side of things. Because if we can't build the same house twice doing stick built, it becomes completely useless to be investing in more factory built. So we need to be able to do both. We need to be able to deal with that regulatory side of things so that we can really build at scale, because factories need to build the same thing over and over again to be really effective. And I think we need to do much more on that side to really innovate more.
Thanks. Thank you. And in my riding of Burnaby Central, it is one of the most expensive cities to rent in Canada. So in markets like Burnaby Central, how critical has the federal support been in enabling projects that might not otherwise proceed?
Yeah, I would say that certainly the programs like CMHC's different financing programs and that sort of thing have been very important. I'll also say that the Lower Mainland has some of the worst development taxes in Canada, coupled with the GTA. And if we really want to deal with affordability in the Lower Mainland, then we really need to do something about development taxes and find other means of funding all the things that development taxes are currently funding. And that would go a really long way for ownership as well as rental.
Thank you. And my final question to you is that has the federal government's approach helped improve builders' confidence or long-term planning when it comes to launching new housing projects?
I think we're starting to get there. There's still a great deal of uncertainty as we've been talking about through the course of these discussions. So consumer confidence is waning. But again, things like getting those deals signed with other provinces outside of Ontario to deal with taxes, both sales taxes as well as development taxes, can really help to spur the market. And certainly in BC, which is only second to Ontario and really hurting right now for starts, and that those kind of moves can make a huge difference to start turning the market and giving some confidence to builders. And nothing helps builders' confidence more than actually having buyers come to the door and actually be ready to make a purchase.
Thanks.
20 seconds left. Thank you, Mr. Chang. Madame LaRouche, pour du...
Ms. LaRouche for 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us. So, my next question, if I can get an answer from both of our witnesses, what would be the most efficient tools to encourage the rapid construction of rental housing without really ramping up speculation? We can start with either one if you want to go ahead and answer, Mr. Moffat and Mr. Lee.
Well, I'll begin. I think the federal government's done a very good job of that with ACLP and MLI Select and some of the other programs and the tax provisions such as accelerated capital cost allowance and taking the HST off of purpose-built rental. I do think the one missing piece is that the federal government during the last election promised to bring back the 1970s era MERB program, and they have not indicated whether or not that program will, that the federal government will make good on that promise. So I think implementing that, or at least announcing to builders and developers, if that's not going to happen, would create a little bit more certainty in the market and give builders and developers an idea of what the policy areas going forward. And then obviously my points earlier about immigration.
D'accord.
I would.
Oui.
Sorry, did you want me to answer?
Oui.
I would just add that in addition to those things, because there has been quite a bit of additional activity by the federal government to support purpose-built rental. One of the frustrations that our members have really felt, though, is when the rules change midstream. So some of the programs out of CMHC have, as they become oversubscribed, you start to see rule changes, which then completely change designs of buildings or make them non-viable. So really sticking with the game plan and not making so many changes to these financing programs would create that certainty and help more projects move forward.
OK, donc rapidement, qu'est-ce qu'on devrait faire pour terminer?
So what should we do to have more transparency in the public funding schemes that exist?
Well, I would say with programs like Build Canada Homes, having those key performance indicators of indicating how many homes will get started under any definition of start, over what time frame, how many will be market rate versus non-market rates, the non-market rate, what will the price points be? It's just that level of transparency that it's difficult for us, as an analyst. I don't know what the federal government is proposing that they will do. So it's hard for me to know whether or not or analyze whether or not that program is good value for money, or if the program is even realistic when it's unclear what the goals and targets and indicators are.
Merci, Madame LaRoche. Mr. Reynolds for 5 minutes, please, and this will conclude the first hour. Mr. Reynolds, then Madame de Rocher.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks again, witnesses, for coming today. Mr. Lee, I wanted to circle back to your discussion on building code. So, as I mentioned earlier, my background is in construction. I'm a construction electrician, been a foreman and general foreman on many projects over the last 20 years. One of the things that I've dealt with is the evolution of Canadian electrical code, and also building code as well. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, I noticed at the front of the Canadian Electrical Code book, it shows the list of people that are on the steering committee or the board that influences or adds their input into the Canadian Electrical Code book, and a lot of them are lobbyists or vendors. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that, if the Canadian Building Code is structured similar.
Yeah, I think certainly on the electrical code, you do see a lot of manufacturers there, a lot of manufacturers looking to have their particular type of equipment being regulated. And we've seen that. I won't go too far down the road of arc fault circuit interrupters, but it's a type of electrical plug that's very expensive that got put into the electrical code a few years ago. And so we do see a lot of lobbying of different types for things to go into the code. So it's why we really talk about the really critical need of looking at affordability with the building code, and that it's not a core objective of the building code, and it really needs to be. And so too does affordability need to be a core objective of all standards that the building code calls up. And so your electrical code and other standards, which don't have a requirement to look at affordability, and given everything that's going on in our housing crisis, we need the code and all the standards that come up, that it calls up, to be much better in terms of look at what are going to be the price impacts and the cumulative price impacts of all of the changes that come together. Because $300 there, $1,000 here, $3,000 there doesn't sound like a lot until you add them all up, and it becomes $50,000 to $100,000 on a new home.
Yeah, especially when you're adding it to the per suite cost. I was working on a 500 suite student residence, which each one had its own panel, and we had to add arc faults, and it just added a tremendous cost to the overall cost of the project and the per suite cost. So also talking about building code, building buildings in Winnipeg, we had to build things that obviously met the national building code, which in certain cases meant meeting earthquake standards. Now, there are no earthquakes in Winnipeg. So, or hurricanes or high winds or anything like that. Obviously, we have some jurisdictional issues with cold and such. Floods, yeah. So how come the National Building Code doesn't have certain codes for certain jurisdictions? Why is it a blanket across the country, build to this standard, even though it's not really applicable in other areas?
It is very regionally specific. So it does have different snow loads, wind loads, seismic stuff for earthquakes. And so that does vary across the country. So you're not, you will get different requirements. But for example, what I was talking about earlier, that wind load on lateral loads, that's being done in a way that it's going to apply practically everywhere, but we don't have the scientific and experiential evidence that shows there's actually a problem there. So you do get different regional variances, and that is important, obviously. When it's colder, you need more insulation, and put it in simple terms and that kind of thing. But we have to be smart about what we actually put in the code and what the outcomes are that we want, so we take care of affordability at the same time.
Yeah, I've also seen a significant increase in cost from codes being added in for future EV chargers and things like that, which obviously the uptake hasn't been that great. So there are certain jurisdictions that are doing better at housing starts in Canada versus other jurisdictions. Can you comment on what the best jurisdiction is in Canada and what they might be doing differently that we could adopt in some of the worst jurisdictions, or at least underperforming jurisdictions?
Yeah, Atlantic Canada's been doing well. The prairies have been doing pretty well. Let's talk about Alberta. That's probably been doing the best over the past couple of years. First of all, no provincial sales tax on housing. There's a good start. Their development taxes have been lower, although they're growing faster than we would like to see. Bad example. I think they're learning bad lessons from Ontario and BC. So we'd like to see that slow down in some cases. They have much more elastic, I won't use the economic term. They're able to respond to demand a lot faster because they're able to get shovels in the ground faster, because they get permits out faster. There's less regulation. The approval system is a lot faster, so that when the market turns, they're able to respond much more quickly. They also do a pretty good job with building codes and being consistent in the province. So they have a lot of things that are going right there, and a lot of ways that other parts of the country could learn from.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. We'll conclude with Madame Desrochers pour 5 minutes.
For 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Well, thank you very much. Indeed, this has been a great conversation, really enlightening to hear from you.
I met with the Mechanical Contractors Association of Canada. Pretty sure you're familiar with them. And we had a long discussion around shortage of skilled laborers and the forecast for the future, which is not looking very good. And I know it's uneven, like everything, right? uneven across the country and different markets. But I'm just wondering if you had the chance to look at what we unveiled last week in the economic update, in the spring economic update, particularly around training 100,000 skilled workers, young people, bringing them into the trades and really having a bit of a single window approach. And if you've had a chance to look at that, I'd love to hear your first take on those programs that we are going to be launching, and if you think that's going to help bridge that gap.
Yeah, I've definitely taken a good look at that, because you're absolutely right. I mean, labor shortages are, hopefully this market turns around. And we're going to see labor shortages everywhere, because prior to COVID and any time that the market is even normal, we have dramatic labor shortages in residential construction. It's going to get worse. That's why more productivity through factory built is good, but we're going to need lots more workers. In terms of the announcement last week, it's a step. I will say this, though, when it comes to residential construction, it's often misunderstood that only about 10% of the workers in our industry outside of Quebec are unionized. So it's really important that we not just be looking through unions to do training. Also, when it comes to residential construction, a lot of the occupations aren't well classified within the system. A lot of them are not red seal trades. So, and we do use red seal trades for sure in residential construction, but again, a majority of our skilled workers are not red seal trades. So we're really looking to work with the government on how we address the rest of the market as well. So it's not to say that the support for red seal trades and going through unions isn't important. We need that. But we also need to do a lot of work to support the rest of the sector and the skilled workers that are doing that kind of work that won't be supported. And it's systemic right now, and it even affects immigration. So we have to get it done properly.
Thank you. Mr. Moffat?
Yes, I would agree with all that. You know, I would also suggest that I think governments, both provincial and the federal government, also need a strategy to retain existing skilled workers. You know, we are seeing in the GTA, many of them leave the industry because the work is simply not available. So again, all of my earlier remarks around creating certainty and a helpful investment climate is incredibly important. You know, my father left the home building industry during a deep recession because there was no work. So while it is important to train the next generation, I think it's as important or more important to make sure that we're able to retain the trades workers that we already have.
This is, I guess, for either of you, but are your organization engaged with technical schools or, you know, counselors, guidance counselors? Like, how do we get young people to want to go into these jobs, basically, is my question. And are your industry involved in that?
Yeah, certainly with the Canadian Home Builders Association and really all of our local and provincial associations, there's a lot of engagement, both with the institutes and colleges, you know, more sort of reach out to high schools as well. I think frankly, we did quite a disservice in this country, you know, 20 years ago, starting to dismantle all the woodworking shops and everything like that in high school as we prepared for the knowledge economy and all of that. I mean, we still need the people that build houses and do a lot of important skilled work across the country. And without saying we need to increase immigration, I think we need to make sure we get immigration right, too, so that the people we are bringing in are those types of workers. There's a lot of emphasis on bringing in high-skilled, the brightest talent from around the world, and that's great to add to the economy. But frankly, we're a really well-educated society, and sometimes it's hard to get Canadians to do the jobs of building Canada that, you know, a lot of the immigrant population has done historically. I mean, immigration has really built Canada quite literally as well as figuratively, and we do ourselves a favor if we got better at that again, too.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. My father was one of those high school. After he left the home building industry, he became a high school shop teacher and was one of those who was in one of those shops that we were seeing downsizing. So I think all of that is important. And I think oftentimes people who are considering going into the trades might have an older sibling or someone who went through an apprentice program and wasn't able to complete it. So, and that can be kind of a turnoff as well. So making sure that the people who go in the trades are actually able to complete their apprenticeship, get a job, and start a good career, I think is incredibly important, because those stories of folks who weren't able to find an apprenticeship really harms that pipeline.
Thank you. Merci, Madame Desrochers.
Thank you, Ms. Desrochers.
This the first hour, so I want to thank the witnesses for appearing. But before we suspend to move into business, it does require a budget to do this study, and I need approval from the committee to adopt a budget of $18,750 to do this study. It's well at the moment. We'll know as we get to the end. It's a projection. Members, focus. Do we have approval of the budget to conduct the study that you approved to undertake?
Yes, we do.
We do. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. With that, we have adopted the budget, and I will suspend for a moment while we transition to the business portion. Thank you, witnesses. Suspend.
you.